Hello, everybody. It's Craig here. Now, I'm just wondering where Richard is.
Hi, this is Richard. This week it's my turn to be out of the studio.
Well, I'm hoping that hopefully next week we'll both be in the studio at the same time. I've got every hope that that might actually happen. So, hello to all our learners from all around the world. It's been a great week again. Lots of interesting things. Quite a challenging week, though, I think, this one, because it brings up things that are quite close to home sometimes, and how to learn to sit with rather than avoid the things we find uncomfortable. Some really interesting discussions around the importance of self-compassion and the fine distinction between, say, what we could call self-appraisal, an ability to be objective about ourselves, our reactions, our behaviours, as opposed to self-criticism. And they're quite different things because the predominant thing in self-appraisal is a kind of a standing back and an observing. It's like a calm, attentive mind that's able to see and recognise things like, oh, that reaction wasn't helpful, or just noticing that behaviour seems to press somebody's buttons. And it's not a vitriolic self-criticism, it's just noticing things that may be important for us to be aware of, as opposed to self-criticism where we actually cut off from being aware of ourselves, being aware of the environment, and we internalise. So we start to brood and ruminate and essentially go into default mode with endless critiquing of ourselves and what's wrong with me, will I ever be all right, etc. So they're quite different things, and we'll probably recognise them a little bit too by one's not associated with stress, although the other one often is. Their self-criticism is often very disempowering and distracting. And compassion for oneself is often a lot harder than compassion for others. And interesting to notice, because when things are much closer to ourselves, our own ego, I suppose, gets caught up. We tend to get a lot more attached to the things that are closest to home, not just ourselves, but the people that are closest to us very often, the people it's easiest to be most critical of. Whereas when there's a step or two away, it's easier to observe and very often to be more objective and a little bit more compassionate for others. And so that sense of identification with things we find uncomfortable in ourselves often leads to the sort of criticism. Is the criticism, questions have come up about does criticism of oneself or criticism of others cause more stress? And it's really, well, it depends. Say experiencing a criticism from somebody else may or may not cause stress. It really depends on whether or not it's internalized or some kind of very negative reaction from someone. One of the interesting studies, say, looking at telomere research, which is a measure of how fast we age, that noticed that experiencing racial discrimination did not necessarily lead to this accelerated aging and the emotional stress that it caused. It was experiencing it and internalizing it. And of course, the internalizing is the going over and brooding and commenting on and reliving the past event and anticipating the next time it'll happen. And we often can go into long stories within our own mind about what everybody thinks, etc. So for the people who experienced it but did not internalize it, perhaps just left the insult, perhaps where it left it where it lay, as it were, did not take it away with them, were not necessarily negatively affected. Now, Richard's got some really interesting things to offer this week about the importance of self-compassion, cultivating self-kindness.
A lot of our learners this week really liked the self-compassion meditation. So it's one thing, of course, to notice that we're self-critical when we're facing difficulties, and then to sort of perhaps explore being more compassionate with ourselves. But then we can actually practice that. And like anything, we can train it through meditation. And that massed practice really lays down those circuits in our brain and helps us to change our relationship with ourselves. And things that learners were resonating with this week were just letting go of the story and actually just being with the sensations in the body, the unpleasant sensations. Soothing touch featured pretty large, just sort of bringing this out of this physical connection to ourselves sometimes can just help to ground us and bring us back to our body, which gets us unstuck from perhaps some of those self-critical thoughts or those judgments or even just worrying about something. And so practicing that through meditation can be a really helpful thing. I know that I certainly love to practice that when things are, if I'm facing a difficult situation, but particularly if I sit down to meditate and then I notice that I'm feeling a little bit vulnerable or in some way upset by something, I'll often do that. I'll place a hand there and I'll just perhaps offer myself some soothing words, or even just sort of make space for the emotion to be there, just create some space around it. And all of these things are acts of self-kindness compared to perhaps criticizing ourselves for feeling vulnerable or trying to fix it or get rid of it.
And so there's some excellent points to reflect on. And one of the things, of course, that helps with self-compassion and the naming and describing is because when we're naming and describing, we're actually standing a step or two back. It implies a kind of non-attachment, an ability to stand back and observe. And that makes it a lot easier for an objective assessment of what's happening in front of us as well. But it just creates a little bit of space. And that little bit of space of non-attachment not only gives less power to the self-criticism, but it also is empowering and gives more choice to us, because without the attachment to the thing, we've got more choice in terms of how we respond to something. Viktor Frankl certainly spoke a lot about that little space, creating the potential to choose in a more discerning way. Some also interesting discussion as well about rewiring for happiness and savouring. And I often like to think that, say, wine tasting as a mindfulness practice. I very much enjoy wine myself, but anybody who enjoys wine or enjoys good food, if they're really eating it with awareness, then they're savouring and they're really tasting it and enjoying it, connecting with each of the senses in the process of savouring it. But Richard's got some really very useful things to say as well about how we can rewire the brain for happiness.
A lot of people also this week noticing that just through becoming more mindful and paying attention throughout the day, they're starting to notice more pleasant moments. And that's something that often happens. People become much more sort of grateful for just simple, pleasant experiences once they start practicing mindfulness. Because I think that quite often when we're not paying attention, we just kind of skip over those moments. You know, we're too focused on outcomes, or perhaps we're caught up in self-criticism, or even just distracted. And so we don't notice those simple moments, you know, just a pleasant exchange with somebody, or the sun coming out from the clouds, or something really nice. And when we start to pay attention, we become much more aware of that. And so we start to notice more the simple moments in life. Of course, a lot of people practice gratitude. People keep gratitude journals. They practice savouring of pleasant emotions or pleasant experiences. But I think just by paying attention and just being more present, we can start to naturally become more grateful. That's certainly something I notice in my own life, and something that I hear from a lot of people in my courses. Someone in my course just tonight actually was saying that as they've started to just be more present throughout the day, they've just enjoyed their exchanges with their colleagues more. They've become, you know, very grateful that they have the job that they have and that they live in the place that they live in. And that's, I think, a really nice thing to pay attention to as we start to retrain that negativity bias and actually start to notice some of the pleasant things that are already there all along. We don't have to create it. We just have to notice it.
Good. So as we can see, there are many, many moments for simple pleasures in our life. And of course, not only when we engage with the simple pleasures, we also unhook from the internal dialogue and endless commentary running in our mind as well. But also, we're cultivating a mindful state of mind to take into the next activity we need to deal with. Some questions about, is there a science on this? Probably if you want to look at, say, something that perhaps views and gives you a good summary of the area would be something like Norman Doidge's The Brain That Changes Itself. That was one of the first really landmark books in this area, but now, of course, there are quite a number. But that would certainly be a good book to start with. Also some interesting discoveries as well about, say, dealing with pain and acute and chronic pain. And of course, it's the emotional reactivity, it's the anticipation, it's the fear. That emotional side of things amplifies the experience of pain, amplifies the suffering associated with pain. And what we know from mindfulness research is not just with acute pain, but also with chronic pain. When a person's more mindful, then it reduces the amplifying effect of fear, anticipation, worry, etc. And also with chronic pain, reduces the the level of hypervigilance for the pain. That is, that attention is always fixated on the pain, but it also helps a person to re-engage their attention with their life, where they are and what they're doing. So it's a very important area, and John Kabat-Zinn's original work, of course, was with severe chronic pain. And so the how-to of that is very important. And he's written quite extensively on that. Full Catastrophe Living is a pretty good introduction to it. So it's goodbye from me this week, and Richard, far, far away. It's a goodbye from him as well, and all of us here in the studio. And we look forward to being with you next week, and we're going to be looking at the big picture and how to embed mindfulness in more and more aspects of your life. So have a great and mindful week. We'll look forward to being with you next week.